In today's first reading from the letter to the Colossians, we get a whole bunch of stuff. But one of the pieces of today's readings that might be the hardest for us at first to understand in the year 2023, but perhaps one of the more important things for us to understand about what it's saying today in 2023, is all this talk about elemental powers of the world and principalities and powers that Jesus is triumphing over. What does any of that mean? And so to do that means a little bit of explaining of how the ancient world thought about some of the forms of these spiritual forces, both the ones that you find embodied in things like empire. If you went to Rome at the time that this letter is being written, you could have gone to an altar to worship the city, the personified reality of Rome itself, or the personified reality of empire itself in some ways. And so these principalities and powers were a way, especially in Jewish circles, of talking about all of the forces opposed to God that were both human and more than human, historical, but also all of the forces that seem to oppose human flourishing, and in their context oppose Jewish flourishing, and by extension then Jewish Christian, early Christian flourishing, all the forces that seem to be opposed against God. Now, we live in 2023. We don't think about silly things like strange forces, and we tend especially to kind of dismiss with our good Enlightenment minds the realities of evil as being more than a metaphor. And yet they might be onto something here. Have you ever noticed, you probably have, or thought about the way in which the structures that we create take on a life of their own? And sometimes these human institutions and structures and powers that take on a life of their own, take on a life of their own in a way that feels both more powerful than any human individual and damaging to human well-being. When we talk about the economy and how, or the market, and how much it, no matter what, has to be obeyed. When we talk about things like the nation, sometimes it for good reasons and sometimes for not good reasons, or about all of the forces of the media or evil in the world, this language of thinking about powers and principalities, a language that's really developed by a 20th century Protestant theologian named Walter Wink, really finds some resonances today for us to be able to deal with these forces that oppose human flourishing that seem bigger than any one of us. And our text today from Colossians talks about how Jesus triumphs over them. And there's a tell there, another important tell. If you look at the last sentence of today's reading, that what has Jesus done? He has removed all of the things that oppose us from our midst, nailing them to the cross, despoiling the principalities and the powers. He made a public spectacle of them, leading them away in triumph by it. Well, what's he talking about there? He's using triumph not in some sort of generic sense, but he seems to be making a reference to the Roman triumph in the city of Rome, or the kind of triumphs you would find in other parts of the ancient world, where you wouldn't just defeat an opposing army. Part of the ceremonial vindication is to march your captives, especially their leaders, through the streets of your city so that everyone can yell at them, throw things at them, and eventually, at least in the Roman case, march them up to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus and sacrifice them. Yeah. So this idea of a triumph that we use in our language today was a very particular ritual that ritualized by humiliating our opponents, humiliating the general of the foreign army that you conquered, or humiliating the leader that you captured, and symbolically expressing how much you dominated them. Now, how does Jesus dominate them? How does our letter talk about Jesus' triumph, by which he has conquered our enemies and is now leading all of the powers and principalities opposed to human flourishing, humiliating them in front of the world? Well, he's not doing it in the same sort of way that you would if you were a Roman Caesar. In fact, he's doing it through his cross. We can think of this as we prepare for Thursday's Feast of the Holy Cross. He's doing it through this counterintuitive way of responding to evil, that responds to evil with an all-powerful good that shows that God is on the side of the person getting executed, not on the side of the people doing the executing. It's a triumph with big quotation marks around it. And the irony of that kind of triumph would have been obvious to anyone who knew what it usually was in that world. And we get another detail of that in today's gospel reading. Today's gospel reading, we get a reminder of who does Jesus choose to be at the core of his new community opposing evil? Well, he chooses Peter and his brother Andrew, a couple of fishermen. Peter, who kind of always rushes in, doesn't know what he's doing, but he's going to be there. His Andrew and James, who seem to at some point, James and John, who seem to at some point be asking Jesus to make them his vice presidents in this new kingdom they don't quite get. A former tax collector, a former worker for the Roman Empire against the Jewish nation, a former zealot, a man named Judas who will eventually betray him. He's not choosing the kind of army that would seem likely to triumph in the usual way. Instead, he is choosing a very different kind of community of people. Those 12 apostles from today's reading, Mary Magdalene and Martha and Mary of Bethany, people who are small, limited, flawed, human, but like Jesus himself, through their love for others, a love sometimes expressed in suffering. That's what Jesus thinks, and what God through Jesus thinks is going to conquer our world, is going to conquer all of the forces that oppose humanity. The feminist lesbian theorist Audre Lorde once said, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. You can't use the same forms of thought and action that were used to create oppression to undo oppression. And here you have Jesus. If you want to fight all of these principalities and powers, you can't do it by becoming another kind of principality and power. You do it through the cross. You do it the godly way, through this strange form of losing that is winning, suffering that is triumphing, dying that is rising to new life. And you and I are all called to that, with our flaws, with our limitations, with our gifts, that as the reading from Colossians says, through our baptism, we're made part of the struggle. We're made part of that core of fixing the world in a non-dominating way. And we're already always made part of the victory that Christ won on the cross, the victory that through the church, you and I, in some small way, today, tomorrow, through the course of our lives, are called to help defeat the powers and the principalities.